Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area is a federally designated area in Missouri and Kansas. We include 41 counties, 29 counties in Kansas, 12 counties in Missouri, and we were designated by Congress in 2006. The point of a heritage area, the purpose of a heritage area, is to help preserve and tell a unique story that helped shape the nation, that took place within a distinctive landscape. So Freedom's Frontier's unique story is the story of the border war that took place right before and during the Civil War in Missouri and Kansas. So right now we are in the Carnegie Building, which is the headquarters for Freedom's Frontier. Our offices are located here, but we also have some really nice exhibits that take you kind of through the whole history of Freedom's Frontier and what it is that we interpret within our 41 counties in Missouri and Kansas. So here is a great map that kind of kicks us off on our story. Of course, in 1854, the KansasNebraska Act was passed, but before that, the Missouri Compromise was passed in 1821, which created Missouri as a slave state and allowed Maine to come into the Union as a free state. Within that Missouri Compromise, there was a section that said slavery would not extend in the territories past basically the southern border of Missouri. So if the Missouri Compromise would have held, Kansas would have automatically been free territory, and anything south of Missouri would have been potentially slave territory, slave states. So in 1854, there was a lot of interest in opening Kansas for white settlement. So before 1854, Kansas was permanent Indian territory. There are a lot of Native Americans that had been moved from the east were settled in Kansas in different reservations. So in 1854, 1850s, there was a lot of interest in opening Kansas territory for folks who wanted to settle, and also they were talking about building railroads through Kansas to California and places west. So the, of course, issue with opening Kansas for white settlement was slavery. So through the Missouri Compromise and a couple of other compromises, they had maintained a balance in Congress between free states and slave states. So in 1854, Stephen Douglas, who was an Illinois senator, introduced the KansasNebraska Act, stating that the settlers of Kansas and Nebraska could choose whether they would enter as a slave state or whether they would enter as a free state based on holding a vote of the settlers within those two territories. So here in the Carnegie Building, we have this exhibit that was created by the National Archives that kind of talks about the KansasNebraska Act and both from a national standpoint, the controversies that it caused in the Senate and the House, and also from a local standpoint, what impacts happened here in Kansas and in western Missouri as a result of the KansasNebraska Act. And that's kind of where a lot of our story in Freedom's Frontier begins. Also in the Carnegie Building, we have these great historic looking maps. They're kind of story-based maps. We have one, a lot of people get a little bit confused when they start looking at these because north isn't at the top. So this one is looking west. West is up on the map because this is the way that you're facing west within the where you're oriented right now. If you're standing looking at this map, that way's west. But the thing that I really like about this map is it shows how interconnected all of these stories were. So even though we have a border here between Missouri and what was Kansas territory, folks were crossing that border all the time. After Kansas territory was open for white settlement, folks in Missouri were moving over to settle. Sometimes they were moving over to vote and then coming right back, and vice versa. Folks in Kansas were crossing the border, and so what we end up with is not just a story that can be told just in Lawrence or just in Lecompton, but a story that happened really within this broader landscape of 41 counties. And then in the main room here in the Carnegie Building, we have an exhibit that was put together by the City of Lawrence and funded by the City of Lawrence. And what this exhibit does really is look holistically at the three themes of Freedom's Frontier. So, as I said, the big theme that we interpret in Missouri and Kansas in the heritage area is that question, that Kansas question of slavery. The issue of Kansas becoming a slave state or a free state is really what kicked off the border war between Missouri and Kansas, but it really sort of evolved into a war between neighbors, a war of retaliation, a war of revenge, of retribution, so that by the time you get to 1863, when Quantrill came to Lawrence and burned down much of the town and killed a lot of the men and children here, it was really a personal issue for the 400 men that came with Quantrill. Many of them felt personally wronged by folks that lived here in Lawrence or here in Kansas, and vice versa. So these two camps, as we think of them, weren't isolated, they weren't separate. They had done business together, they had known one another, and through this big issue of slavery, they had conflicts, and those conflicts devolved into violent conflicts. While this is our big story, we also look at a theme that we call settling the frontier. So here on the west wall, we look at some of those settlement issues, and especially some of those issues that concern the loss of freedom for all those Native Americans that were living here in Kansas, which was permanent Indian territory before the KansasNebraska Act. So not only the loss of freedoms for those Native Americans when this land opened, but also the loss of freedoms when they were moved off of their ancestral lands into Kansas, so that lands further east could be open for white settlement. So here we see a lot of faces of Native Americans that played a big role here in Kansas and on the border of Missouri and Kansas, and also folks like Henry Leavenworth, who were important in settling some of the first white settlements in permanent Indian territory, and those would have been the forts. And here along the big wall, we talk about the border war between Missouri and Kansas, starting with the KansasNebraska Act. You'll see a lot of faces in the roles of some of the big players, and also some people we don't know very well. So Charles Robinson is someone who folks in Kansas are very familiar with for his role as the first governor and his role in Kansas during the territorial period. But then you also see folks who aren't so well known, like Richard Brunner here, who was enslaved as a Missourian, self-emancipated, and then joined up with the Federal Army during the war. So after the Civil War ended, that didn't immediately mean freedom for the thousands of slaves that lived in the United States and that lived in Missouri. So in Missouri, orders of emancipation were signed in January 1865. Within that, there were a lot of issues of struggling for freedom and struggling for equal rights. Then that grew out of the Civil War. And a lot of the struggles for equal rights are connected to these 41 counties in Freedom's frontier. So along this wall here, we see we are able to learn some of those struggles that, especially as they are tied to Missouri and Kansas. So you can learn about the exodusters, and you can learn about lack of freedoms that occurred shortly after the Civil War, with segregation, discrimination, that ran all the way through today, quite frankly. We learn about the fight for equal education that took place with the Brown versus Board of Education case, but also within Missouri and Kansas there were a lot of other smaller cases for integrated education that were happening. And then of course we take the story here in Missouri and Kansas all the way up to Brown versus Board of Education, and also Harry Truman, who was from Missouri. Harry Truman integrated the armed forces when he was president. So here in Kansas and Missouri, we kind of have that through line of the first African-American troops fighting during the Civil War at the Battle of Island Mound, all the way through Harry Truman integrating the armed forces. This building that I just walked you through was the Carnegie Library in Lawrence, and as the Carnegie Library for many, many years, it was a integrated space where people could come together for learning. One of those people who found refuge here in the Carnegie Library was Langston Hughes. When Langston Hughes was a young boy, he lived here in Lawrence and attended school here in Lawrence. And although the schools here in Lawrence weren't segregated, the classroom that Langston Hughes attended was segregated. And he's written a lot about his experiences here in Lawrence, and also the fight for equality that he went through as a student.